Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and is there any franchise quite like Resident Evil? Well, if I ask you viewers what you want from Resident Evil 8, which, at time of writing, doesn't exist, I'm sure I would get a lot of different answers. What constitutes a good Resident Evil game can get you extremely varied responses. If I asked, just for the sake of comparison, what people want from a Devil May Cry sequel, the answers would be roughly the same within a small margin. Resident Evil has been a lot of things over the years, and that's without looking at all the spin-offs and movies. But perhaps in its simplest form we can categorize it as Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3, and Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6. The earlier games have less emphasis on action and more focus on puzzles and resource management, although there has always been a strong element of action, with players using high-powered weaponry in various situations. Those aspects were played up as time went by. Whilst the games have always been campy, they likewise played up those elements as well, starting especially in Resident Evil 4 to most people's eyes. See such amazing scenes as your right hand comes off. And on top of that, Resident Evil 5 and 6 were co-op games. Over the years I've heard so many arguments both for and against various aspects, and people claiming true Resident Evil is this or that. So what should Resident Evil 8 be? What do we want from it? What do you want from it? Is it possible to satisfy everyone? The people who want something more like Resident Evil 1 or 2, and the people who want something more like 5 and 6, or 4, or Code Veronica, or whatever. Well, let's start with story. Should Resident Evil 8 have new characters, or fan favourites, series veterans such as Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine? Maybe it should focus on side characters who haven't played such large roles. An example, Rebecca Chambers and Barry Burton. Now keep in mind, there are no right or wrong answers here. Introducing new characters is by no means a bad thing, it's a good thing, it's a great way to expand a setting with new perspectives. After all, most of our Resident Evil cast are zombie veterans at this point. They've had 20 years experience at poppin' heads, which naturally means they have some understandings of how situations work. For example, if Chris is the main character and he comes up against a giant snake, it's not going to be the first one he's taken down. If our main character is a regular citizen, chances are their reaction to a giant monster snake are going to be a little more exaggerated. Beyond that, let's talk about camera angles. Over the shoulder, fixed, first person. These all offer quite different experiences at the end of the day. Each have their strengths and weaknesses. Fixed cameras definitely provide some very interesting chances from a design perspective. Whilst I am not at all opposed to the idea, I don't think the chances of it being used are very high. But I'd be 100% on board if they did. Because you can play that in with the gameplay in very interesting ways. It can be used to obscure certain elements and add to that feeling of claustrophobia. How about gameplay? Well, I think it's fair to say that guns are going to be included in some form. But how about melee attacks? Personally, the melee system in Resident Evil 4 and 5 is one of my favourite parts of those games, and it plays a huge role in the game for me. In Mercs, for example, it's more beneficial to land a melee finisher in 5 than using a gun because you get more time added. It also helps you save on ammo, and the dynamics it added to the gameplay were interesting to me when it came to making those decisions and having a plan in your mind. I know that this enemy will be able to be dispatched with a single head stun into melee, meaning I can save my shotgun ammo for a higher damage resistance enemy or boss. Plus I just found it a very satisfying form of gameplay feedback, which is largely in part due to the animations and the sort of response you get from punching a zombie feeling very good. Then there's co-op, which people rightly say drains all tension or horror from a game. Whilst it's very possible to be afraid when in a group, solitude intensifies that feeling tenfold, knowing that you're isolated and alone. And when we're talking about a video game, well, it's harder to get immersed in a tense setting when there's two of you, generally speaking, and yet at the same time, Resident Evil's never been all that scary to me. If we were talking about Silent Hill, I could definitely see the argument. In Resident Evil, I just don't really get the argument. If Resident Evil 1 had been co-op with Chris and Jill, I really don't think it would have made the game all that less spooky, to be honest. Whereas if you're playing Silent Hill 2, and then there's two of you running around battering things with, like, sticks of wood, I definitely get that. But again, it's very subjective. And at the same time, playing co-op with your friends is fun, and it adds a lot of replay value to the games, and it can add interesting gameplay. I've played through Resident Evil 5 and 6 a bunch of times with different people, just because I enjoy going through the games multiple times with a new friend or whatever, you know? Now, all that taken into account, I'm going to tell you what I would do if Capcom drilled into my home and went, listen, you, design Resident Evil 8 for us, because we're going to give our multi-million-dollar franchise to you and hope that you don't screw it up. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, of course, and that is completely fine, and do feel free to share your opinions or what you want from Resident Evil 8 or the franchise in general down below. What aspects and elements you would like, what you want them to focus on. With that said, here's my thoughts on what I would do with a potential Resident Evil 8. Keep in mind, this is largely coming off the top of my head. So, Resident Evil 8. The idea I have would be, well, to start off with, we'd be playing on the number 8 in a low-key way. What is 8? I just drew one with my finger in the air. It's like two circles that are connected. It's also a little similar to the design of the Ouroboros. Ouroboros? However you pronounce that. And in that sense, RE8 would have no beginning and no end. No, RE8 would be split between two campaigns, and the story would involve Ouroboros to some minor extent, in that it would bring Albert Wesker back. I know he died in RE5. Honestly, Resident Evil needs a strong overarching villain. Wesker is popular, and he's fun. Like, I don't see why not to bring him back. Sure, you can make the argument, oh well, he died, he shouldn't come back to life. But really, it's not that big of a deal, especially in this franchise. I mean, do you remember how many times we had to kill Simmons in 6, or Birkin in 2? Things come back to life all the damn time. As for how he comes back, not really important, honestly. Maybe he's slowly regenerating after being blown up in that volcano. Maybe that was a clone we fought. Take your pick. Maybe someone gets some DNA from Jake and injects it into like a single cell they found smeared on the side of the volcano, and Wesker pops up and he's like, hello, I'm Wesker. You will give me an egg. Take your pick. Either way, you can include that in the story, in some sense, like how he's come back and how it plays into everything. The main idea, though, is that you'd have two campaigns. One would be more action-oriented, the other more survival-oriented. The game would be roughly split 60-40 in favour of the survival. These two campaigns would be connected, but not directly related to the other. Although the potential of beating both of them and unlocking a third campaign is a possibility too. So here's a brief rundown of what I'd have in mind for the two of them. The survival campaign would feature new playable characters and take place in an urban environment. Think somewhat akin to RE2 and 3. Personally, I think a city in Japan would be a great idea, something extremely dense and vertical. But honestly, it could be fun to have something in an old city in Europe as well. You know, think one of those places that's been around for hundreds of years, so there's a blend of modern buildings and ancient infrastructure, really old buildings as well. Lots of room for Gothic architecture, which they seem so fond of. Either way, you would play as some effective nobody, a civilian caught up in the outbreak, perhaps the unleashing of the T-virus or something else that causes a zombie outbreak. You get the idea. Through your character's backstory, you would have some connection to the whole thing. Maybe your character worked for a firm that was involved in the logistics or shipping or financing of this outbreak in some way. Maybe it was a shipping company and they accepted a job to bring in all these containers into the city for a huge amount of money, no questions asked. And your character was like, this doesn't seem legal, but whatever. You know, just something like that that ties them in loosely to the whole situation and allows some development there. This campaign would be in first person, ideally, with a very limited focus on combat. And the first person would be to help you self-insert as this new character, who probably wouldn't be in the franchise after this game. They would be more like a character just for this game, just so you can self-insert. Limited focus on combat, more about scraping together items and solving puzzles. The first person view is great for close examination of items and environments, whilst also narrowing your perspective, which helps with the tension. Weapons in this segment should be largely disposable, and your character's skill with them limited. If you're a random civilian, you're probably not going to be that great at using weapons. You wouldn't start with any weapons, and that would help drive into the player's mind that they aren't really supposed to be fighting in this campaign, just surviving. Enemies wouldn't drop items or give EXP or anything like that, and it would be encouraged to avoid them, for the most part. Hiding and outrunning enemies would play a factor. It wouldn't be a stealth game, but stealth would be an option available to you. A system would be in play where you can pick up objects almost anywhere. Let's say you press left trigger wherever you are, your character would bend down and then they would pick something up, whether it's a rock, a can, you know, anything that you can throw. And then you would use this and you'd throw it. I mean, you could throw it to make a sound as a distraction. If there's some zombies by a door that you want to get through, throw whatever you picked up off to the side, they'll go shuffling over there, you can sneak on by. Or you could throw it at the zombies to, you know, stagger them for a bit so you can rush on past. You could also use this for certain puzzles, and it would be nice if there was some sort of physics involved to some extent. Like, I don't know, say there's like a button that you can't physically reach. You could pick something up and throw it at the button to activate it, stuff like that. The idea would be that it has a wide set of uses you can apply to it, some of which are more creative than others. The point would be to establish that you are largely powerless and have to survive in a relatively realistic manner. Weapons would be around here and there, but again, rare and hard to use in a certain sense. It could even be that, like, say you find a pistol, once you've used all the bullets in it, you just throw the pistol away. I don't know. Either way, powerful weapons would be very scarce and hard to come by. During your first playthrough, when you haven't unlocked anything, once you've, like, speedrun the game and then you unlock, like, the infinite Mega Magnum, then by all means, go ham. I also think this would be interesting to work in co-op, but I don't think it should be forced on the player. If you're playing single player, then maybe it's just you. Either way, think less side-by-side co-op and more intersecting or parallel co-op, almost like how Leon and Claire's things work in RE2. You would be playing at the same time, and your characters would be able to communicate via their phones or walkie-talkie as you are talking with the other player on voice chat, but you wouldn't often be in the same room. Does that make sense? There would be an emphasis on splitting up and sharing resources and working together. Let's say you find a door that you can't get through. Well, the other player is in another section of the building, they can open that door for you. And there would be ways for you to share items without physically handing them over. Like maybe you can throw something through a window for the other player, stuff like that. And imagine, if you have one gun between you and you have to sort of swap it between each person, I think that would add an interesting sort of tension and dynamic to everything. An emphasis on splitting up and sharing resources. Let's say there's a puzzle that you need to solve, but there's some zombies near it. One player would need to draw the zombies away, whilst the other works on the puzzle. You'd be able to hand each other items, bullets, basically anything you can pick up, you could give to the other player. And it would be up to you how to divide them up. Especially considering how rare some of these things would be, you'd have to be very careful. Environmental design could really shine here. The second player might have vantage points from which they could see enemies and items and warn the other player about, you know, oh, in the next room there's a zombie hiding behind a box, which maybe you wouldn't see too well if you were the first player. I'm a big fan of environmental hazards that can be avoided through observation. If you just run through, then you should expect to be punished. If you take your time and you're careful and you look all around you in a more slow-paced setting, as this would be, then I think there should be traps that can be avoided simply through knowing they are there because you used your eyes. The second player, you know, they have vantage points. They could see enemies, items, And from the way they're heading, it would allow you to plan things out. Maybe only one of you has the map, so you have to physically describe to the other player where something is, you know? Or where to go, which room would be a good idea to head into. I also like the idea that communicating with the other player would potentially alert enemies in the area. I don't know how that could play into the game, honestly, especially if you're not using in-game voice chat, but Discord, as an example. It's a possibility, at any rate. Say you have your mic plugged in and the game detects sound from it, which means there would be the option of communicating with the other player in ways you might have to in that sort of scenario in real life. Hand gestures, flashing a light, maybe even writing something down. It is a very hard mechanic to implement that would be easy to work around. As mentioned, you could just use out-of-game voice chat, which I think most people prefer, I know I do. But I really like this idea of the communication playing into the gameplay and being a mechanic in that sense. But I do wonder if it could realistically work without just being a hassle. To go on with this idea, there could be moments where the voice chat is cut off. Even if you're using the in-game voice chat, maybe there are segments where, say, your character's phone runs out of charge, or you go into an area with no reception. The voice chat just cuts out completely. Wouldn't that be... I mean, on the one hand, it would be annoying, but it would be annoying in the sense that Mr. X chasing you around is annoying. It adds tension, and it's something that you have little control over in some sense, and it would make you have to sort of start thinking in ways that you wouldn't necessarily start thinking. That's something that could be really hard to get right in video games. How do you balance convenience and playability with things that surprise the player and they just flat out wouldn't expect? I mean, it goes back to, remember a couple of years ago with Arkham Asylum, with that whole, I think, hallucination bit where like your TV kind of messes up and stuff. Things like that, even if they're gimmicky, it can be really interesting to play with the player's expectations. Or going even further back, Psycho Mantis reading your memory card and all that stuff. I like when games do that, not overuse it, but when they do it in a way that feels good. So yes, it would be very hard to implement, it could be potentially too gimmicky, but I think it would be a cool feature. A lot of games have co-op, but they never make communication part of the gameplay in almost every single co-op game I've played. I can see why, frankly, as it's so easy to work around, but it might be nice for players who are willing to commit to that system. It's always an option for them, you know? If you want to play using the in-game voice chat, but having your voice actually be in the game to some extent, where if you speak, an enemy will hear you, I don't know, I think that could be pretty fun. In terms of controls, this campaign would be simple: walk, run. No crouch walking like in so many stealth games, because I absolutely hate that, and I think it's so stupid. Like, have you ever tried crouch walking in real life? After a few minutes, your back would be completely shot. If you want to be quiet, just move quietly. I don't think we need a sprint button either, just hold the stick in all the way to move at your top speed. Of course, we have keyboards to consider, where, you know, they're, what are they, analog or digital, whatever. There's no sort of gradient for it. You're either 100% or 0%. So on PC, keyboard, yeah, maybe have a sprint button. No real quick time events or melee options. The inventory space would be tied to backpacks, and you could play around with like a weight system, like the more you're carrying, the slower you move, but honestly, I can't think of how that would really play in a way that's meaningful or fun. It would just kind of be a thing to manage for the sake of managing it. Theoretically, it should be possible to beat this campaign without ever using a weapon once, but there would also be ways to kill every enemy if you tried hard enough. It just wouldn't be encouraged. The idea is to promote freedom and creativity amongst the players. There's a balance to strike between optimal play. Killing enemies shouldn't have direct rewards, but should still feel rewarding to pull off if you use some environmental trick, you know? This could also work by having, for example, enemies move, meaning you'd have to potentially deal with them later on, whereas if you kill the enemy, it might be a little hard, but you know that enemy will be gone. and you won't have to worry about them if you want to backtrack or worry about them coming after you from behind. Something that Resident Evil 2 kind of falls a bit flat on. It's so easy to just run past enemies because they won't really follow you. They will follow you to within their tethering distance. After that, they won't. And of course, that is a game balance thing, because if you have enemies that follow you indefinitely, that can really start breaking games. If you remember the alpha in Neo, where enemies would chase you through the entire level, it was so easy to mess things up. So again, it's another hard thing to balance, but there are ways to work around it in a more artificial sense. For example, the game can keep track and say, if you didn't kill the enemies in this area, there will be more enemies in the next area. It won't literally be the same enemy, but the implication will be that enemy has moved forwards, you know? Either way, this campaign would be low-key, down-to-earth, puzzles, localized threats, and the like. It would play into the overall story because, well, at some point your character would either locate an important item or some evidence, or be revealed that, due to one reason or another, you're immune to the virus, or either way you have something important that ties into the other campaign and the story as a whole. And at the end it would tie the two of them together nicely. Now, as for the other campaign, this would have you playing as Chris and Jill, for example, would play more like Resident Evil 2 Remake and RE4-5. Have you played Remake 2? Imagine that sort of camera angle, that sort of movement. You can move and shoot. The main difference here would be, well, imagine Remake 2, but you have a dodge button. It would also work as a sort of shoulder barge, so you know, your character sort of violently jerks in one direction. And if you shoulder barge into an enemy, a weak enemy, if it isn't facing you, or if it's in a state where they're vulnerable, you could dodge into them to stumble or stagger them. For example, let's say a zombie is facing you and they're coming at you. If you just dodge into them, they're just going to grab you and start munching. If they haven't noticed you, then you could just shove into them and sort of knock them down so you can move past them. Or you can think of it as almost like a parry. If you time it just right, like just before the enemy hits you, you can dodge into them and sort of send them stumbling as a counter-attack kind of thing, which would work a little bit like Resident Evil 6's counter system, if you remember that. But again, it's not something you could just, you know, run up to every enemy and dodge into them to like knock them aside like a bowling bin. It would be a timing system. It would also have a melee system very similar to RE4 and 5. So you have the Resident Evil 2 Remake gunplay. You focus your aim, you shoot an enemy in the head, it staggers them, then you can run forwards and do a melee attack, which would differ depending on the body part. So the head stagger would have one melee attack, if you shoot them in the legs you have another attack, and so on and so forth. It would allow you to save ammo and deal with enemies in a more efficient manner, whilst also contrasting the difference between Chris Jill and the other campaign's newcomers, who are, you know, they're throwing rocks at things, they're desperately trying to struggle with a single zombie, whereas Chris, he's been killing zombies for like 20 years by now, so he is very efficient at taking them out. The gunplay would be implementing a lot more close-quarter stances, think like central axis relock. The reasoning behind this should be obvious. Zombies are by and large very close to you when they're attacking you, so you don't want to be holding your arms out like some prat in a wide stance where they can slap your gun away. You keep it tight to the chest, my man. This campaign would also have more varied locations and more ammo and weapons available. I almost like the idea of it being mission based, whereas the other campaign would be sort of one long continuous thing through a single area. But not a single area, a single game environment, whereas the other one, maybe it's divided into missions, and in between the missions you have a chance to choose a loadout even, maybe, who knows? Which would be, you know, a bit more like how Resident Evil 5 does it, which would allow you to visit more varied locations. Either way, I like the idea of this mode being more of the sort of adventure sort of feel that 4, 5 and 6 have, especially 4 and 5, where you go through these really interesting sort of weird environments, you know, like the village, the castle, the island, and then Resident Evil 5 you go to these underground ruins. It would also have, you know, more ammo and weapons and weapon customization. So ammo should be relatively scarce, so much as to encourage smart play. threat assessment, and engagement. Also, Jill is not blonde because I don't like that. That's silly. Realistically, you could replace Chris and Jill with any series vets. You could have Barry, you could have anyone. Those are just my preferred characters. I honestly wouldn't mind Jake coming back. I know a lot of people don't like Jake, but I honestly don't mind him, and I'd be fine with him coming back. I wasn't crazy about him, he's not my favourite character, but if we're continuing the Wesker storyline, it could make a lot of sense. Plus, you know, he has real fun melee attacks. I feel like Chris and Jake would make an interesting team, but I also really like Jill, so I don't know, Jake and Jill, that could be entertaining because of, you know, Jill's interactions with Wesker. Campaign could also have more boss fights, and I'm not sure which should have it, but I really like the idea of having a nemesis tyrant pursuer that chases the players, the characters, potentially in both campaigns, just to contrast how you deal with it. In one of them, you would have the weapons to deal with it, and maybe, you know, tanks or vehicles, or, you know, just more artillery, high explosive ways to deal with this pursuing threat, whereas the other one would be more like, oh no, I have to hide and hope it doesn't catch me because I will be powerless against it. You throw a rock at it and it would be like, excuse me, I will eat your rock and then I will eat your face. There could even be a twist, like, maybe you think it's just in one of them, like maybe you think it's the same tyrant chasing you in both campaigns, but at the end, when the campaigns connect, maybe it turns out there was two of them all along, and they both bust out from like either ends of a corridor, and you're like, uh-oh, what could be worse? Beat both campaigns, and maybe you unlock a short third campaign just so you can get the true ending that ties the story up nicely. It would be maybe a mix of both, you playing as one of the characters from each, meaning that one character would be largely protecting the other whilst they do other things. If you're doing this in single player, it would work a little different to co-op, but it's easy to get past the issues that Resident Evil 5 had with Sheva's AI, so I don't think that would be an issue. Then of course you need a bonus mode that plays like, you know, Mercenaries or Raid mode, where you can include more characters to play as, have a progression system to keep you coming back, and you know, that sort of replayability. Personally, I feel like this game would have something for everyone. That's just me. I know a lot of people would rather have a complete horror survival focused game, others want pure action, some people want like a sequel to Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7, I'm gonna admit, I don't care for it. I don't think it's like a bad video game or anything, just nothing about it really appeals to me. The start of it, way too scripted, the rest of it just doesn't appeal to me, but I totally understand why some people like it. Whilst I prefer the action games, 4, 5 and 6 are my favourite. 5 would be my personal favourite. I'm not averse to some of the other things. I really enjoyed Resident Evil 2's remake. I think this mix I described in the video would be a great way to highlight all of the series' strengths, with the tension a civilian would have in these situations, versus the calm approach the BSAA and X-Stars members would have. Story beats. Wesker's return, played marginally less hammy than in 5. He can still be larger than life and ridiculous, but just a little bit more down to earth. Could tie in with Jake and the Ouroboros and start to bring in those other companies that were always mentioned but never described, such as the one Ada worked for, yada yada. Plenty of room to have cameos from other characters. Hell, you could include Alex Wesker from the end of Revelations 2, where she was in Natalie or whatever, spoilers. Maybe that's a plot point. Whereas the new characters would act more like an introduction for the series, for newcomers. If you are a newcomer, it would maybe be encouraged that you play that mode first, that campaign, and a way for veterans to see through new eyes, and perhaps get a stronger appreciation for the efforts of the veteran characters put in to have this stark contrast where one zombie for Chris, not really a big issue. One zombie for the newcomer is a considerable threat. They'd be fighting like not many at once and all. A way to see the growth and development. Anyway, that's what I would do. I'm not saying it's what's gonna happen, maybe it isn't what should happen. That's what I think I would do. That would be a Resident Evil game I would love to play. But what about you? Let me know in the comments. And of course, thanks for watching, and I will catch you guys next time.